Well, welcome to another Friday night. A number of months ago, I decided to do a series called Understanding Trauma, which was to take kind of what I've learned over the last 20 years and summarize it into the key pieces of understanding trauma and healing from trauma. And today is going to be the last of that series. And we're going to talk about boundaries. And this to me is where recovery from trauma gets super practical. It's where the rubber meets the road. What I have found is if people don't get healthy boundaries in their recovery, they only grow so far and then they stop and they just can't get beyond a certain point because their boundaries remain at an unhealthy place. And so this is an absolutely critical but difficult part of recovery in making progress in recovery. I think the second thing to say up front about this topic is that when most of us start recovery, our focus is I want to change me, and we learn stuff about us, we grow in self-awareness, but then all of a sudden we realize I still got to live with people, I still got to interact with people, relationships are part of my life. But some of those aren't healthy. And so I quickly begin to realize, wow, if I'm going to get healthy, then I have to be within relationships where I can be safe, where I can keep growing. And that means I have to set boundaries within relationships. Now that now involves my recovery now involves other people, affects other people. And they don't always like what I'm doing. And so I can meet with opposition, I can meet with anger, hostility, I can get shamed and demeaned by people. And so this whole boundaries thing, all of a sudden now it's not just about me changing and agreeing with the change, it's about me changing and others not liking some of the stuff I'm requiring, and now I get opposition. And that's not a lot of fun. And so another way to say this is recovery at some point is going to involve, am I willing to value my growth over pleasing everybody? Or do I still need to please everybody all the time? And I'm willing to sacrifice my growth in order to please everybody. And that's what this whole thing boils down to and why it's such an important topic. Let me just say up front about complex trauma and boundaries. When I started teaching this 20 years ago, I read a bunch of books, and there's some excellent books on boundaries by bestsellers that have been just very helpful to thousands and thousands of people. And what I found with them is they had so much good information, but a lot of it was tools that people with complex trauma couldn't put in effect in their life. And so they were frustrated by the books. It gave them some practical tools, but for some reason they couldn't implement those tools in their life. It's like complex trauma gave them unique challenges in this area of setting and enforcing boundaries. And so what I began to realize is we need to be able to think much deeper about boundaries in light of complex trauma. Part about complex trauma, which to me is the key piece, is the complex trauma creates these deep core issues that we've talked about on many occasions: shame, fear of abandonment, codependency. Those get in the way of being able to enforce healthy boundaries. With shame, I need everybody to like me, so I don't want to say no to anybody. So as long as a person has deep shame issues, they're never going to be able to set healthy boundaries and enforce them. And so the deep issues that come out of complex trauma, unless they're addressed, unless people heal and grow in those areas, healthy boundaries is never going to happen in their life. So let's just begin with a definition of boundaries. The best way that I try to define it is it's the rules and guidelines that I live by so that I can be healthy and safe in all areas of my life. So the rules and guidelines I live by so I can be healthy and safe physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and then that's part's just me, but then so I can have healthy relationships, and so I can be safe in relationships. So those boundaries are the rules that we set, the guidelines we set for safety and for health. Now some look at boundaries and they just think of it's saying no to everything. It's all negative. But it's really, really important, I think, to understand is the reason I'm saying no is so that I can say yes to the good stuff, to getting my needs met, to having my priorities met. So I am not going to just let my limbic brain desires that could be very unhealthy run my life, because that would destroy me. That would keep me from ever accomplishing my desires, my goals, what's healthy. So I have to say no to some things so that I can say yes to the right things. So hopefully what you can see with this is that boundaries then, for them to happen, I need some core beliefs. So number one, I have to believe that I am a valuable person and I deserve to have my needs met. And I'm just as deserving as anybody else, and that my needs are just as important as your needs. So that is a foundational belief behind all boundary setting. I have value, my needs matter just as much as yours. Second belief is I'm the one responsible to create a healthy life for myself. I can't look to others to create this healthy life for me. I have to create this for myself. The third one is I can make choices. I am not helpless, powerless to make choices for myself. It doesn't mean the choices are going to be easy, but I have the agency to stand up for myself and make choices for myself. And you can see that most of those core beliefs, complex trauma messes them up. And that's why complex trauma is such an issue when it comes to healthy boundaries. Now let me take it a step further. There's two types of boundaries that we've been talking about. So we go by internal and external boundaries. So internal boundaries is the rules I make for myself, what I'm going to make myself do, what I will not allow myself to do. So that can be with my food, my diet, that can be with sleep, that can be with how I use my time, social media, how I spend my money, my daily routine every day, what I do, exercise-wise, reading, meditation, all those things are internal boundaries. The second type is external boundaries. So that's boundaries in relationship to other people. And so it's what I'm going to do to others, how I treat them, and what I won't do to others, how I won't treat them, and how I won't let them treat me. So I will treat them with respect. I won't let them treat me with disrespect. I will require them to treat me with respect if they want a relationship with me. But there's a second part to external boundaries, and that's how close I let somebody into my life. So will I let them talk to me every day, or will I only let them talk to me once a week, or will I just see them once a month? Will I share around these deep topics with them, or will the conversations be very superficial? So it's how close I let somebody into my inner world. So those are external boundaries. So there's four components then that are important to understand around boundaries. Some boundaries express morals, right, wrong. Another way to say it, they express love. So I won't lie, I won't cheat, I won't steal, I won't be disrespectful, I won't gossip, I won't express anger in unhealthy ways. Those are boundaries that are basically morals. And so they control how I talk, the filters I put into my speech. They control my sex life, they control my work life, my work ethic, being responsible, working hard, working when nobody's watching. They control how I relate to others with respect, with honesty. For most people, most of these moral values are non-negotiables. These are always right, always the right way to treat people. So no compromise is allowed. But secondly, there's boundaries that just express my preferences, my comfort zone, not my personal priorities. And these are flexible. These are negotiable. So you look at a marriage. So you might have one partner who's an early bird and another partner who's a night owl. So one likes to go to bed early, one wants to go to bed late. You gotta figure that out, because one person says, my boundary is I want to go to bed at 9 o'clock, and the other says, no, I want to go to bed at 11 o'clock. So those are very important. Then you're going to get differences in the desire for the frequency of sex, the type of sex. You're going to have differences in the cleanliness of the house, how neat everything is. You're going to have differences in the type of movies that you watch. Some are going to love action movies or horror movies. Others are going to hate that and want rom-coms. And those are boundaries for that person. But in a relationship, how do you make that work? And so you need some flexibility. So those are your preferences. Those aren't right or wrong. It's just different. But we have boundaries around that. And then personal safety, that's not necessarily a moral issue. And this is where others might be able to do this, but I can't, because I'm too weak at this point in my recovery. So others might be able to go to a bar and hang out with friends and not be tempted to drink, even though they're an alcoholic in recovery, but they're kind of grown to a point that that's no longer a problem. You just can't go there yet. And so what you begin to realize is this isn't a right or wrong thing. This is where I'm at in my journey, and it's all about I'm vulnerable. And it's okay to be vulnerable. That's just the reality of it. But I have to protect the vulnerable me, and that boundary might change in 5 years. I might grow to the point where I'm not vulnerable in that area anymore, but right now I am, and I need to protect me. A fourth area, which is important to understand, is we often think of boundaries as, I got to keep out unhealthy, toxic people. And that's a big part of boundaries. But sometimes we set boundaries with people and don't let them get too close just because we have limited time and energy. So I've used the illustration before of a Lego block that has the 6 nubs on it. And so it's like in my life, I'm capable of 6 close relationships. That's it. That's all I have time and energy for. And so I have a lot of wonderful friends that I would love to have them as one of the nubs on my Lego block. But I can't. Because if I was to put them close as a close friend, I would have to take somebody off that Lego block that's already there. And I don't want to do that, because the ones that are there are well thought out, careful, important people in my life. And so this person can be a wonderful person, but they're always going to remain a casual friend, because I just don't have more room for another close friend. And so I have to set a boundary. And it's not because they're bad, it's just because I'm limited. Another thing that I think is a helpful illustration is to think of guardrails on a mountain road. And so the guardrails are there to protect you. The guardrails are there to keep you on the right, healthy road. But a lot of people growing up in complex trauma, they have looked at boundaries as restricted. They just take the fun out of life. They're dumb rules that just cramp your style, don't let you do anything. And so it'd be one way to look at guardrails is, they just keep you restricted on this little wee road. But what we have to understand is that's not the purpose of the guardrails, to be like these mean prison wardens that keep you stuck and take away your freedom. No, they're there to keep you safe and healthy. And so it's so important to understand that What would happen if I went outside the guardrails? If I go, okay, I'm just going to have freedom. I'm going to drive wherever I want. I don't care about these dumb guardrails. You go off and you'd have terrible consequences and die. And so it's so important when you think about a boundary. Some boundaries are not healthy. They're not good guardrails. They're made by authorities that are dumb rules that suit them. But before I put all boundaries in that category, I need to be able to think through what would be the consequence if I stepped outside of this boundary. If it's going to be a really negative consequence down the road, I might have instant gratification, but if it's going to end up down the road with a lot of pain, then that's a good boundary. And so even though it might feel restrictive right now, and it might feel like it's taking away my fun and my freedom, in the long run, it's actually keeping me safe. So I have to think of boundaries more than just instant results that I want. In terms of instant results, I have to think of them in terms of long-term consequences. So let me go to this whole idea of setting boundaries. So again, with complex trauma, for people to actually set a boundary, it takes a lot of courage. But that's not usually where the problems happen. The problem happens not just in setting boundaries, it's enforcing boundaries. And that is where it just takes a lot of work. So it's a lot easier to set a boundary than to enforce a boundary. And so like I said, many set internal boundaries, great rules for themselves. They're going to have this healthy life. They got it all mapped out, but they don't stick to it. 3 months later, they fall apart. Or I think a lot of people, they start learning about boundaries and they go, I got to set boundaries with my mom. I got to set boundaries with my sister. I got to set boundaries with this friend. And they think they have this unrealistic expectation that they're going to go and explain the boundary to their friend or their mom, and their mom is going to see how wise it is, and their mom's even going to validate them, say, wow, thank you, that's great, I'm so glad you came up with that, and everybody's just going to respect it, and it's just going to be smooth sailing. Problem is that rarely happens. Usually what happens is you get opposition. Usually things don't go smoothly. And that's why we have to then enforce it. And that's where it gets so difficult. So there's 2 situations where it's really difficult to enforce a boundary. So the first one is this internal boundaries and external boundaries. They all affect the limbic brain and the cortex. And as long as the limbic brain and the cortex are in agreement, then we're not going to have any trouble setting boundaries. The problem with complex trauma is the limbic brain and the cortex often are in disagreement. And that's when we have trouble enforcing boundaries. If our limbic brain wants to change a boundary and our cortex says, no, we shouldn't, this is healthy, often the limbic brain wins out. So let me give you an example. So you might say, I'm going to start getting up at 6 o'clock every morning. I'm going to read. I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to get a healthy lifestyle happening. Initially, your limbic brain and cortex agree and you do that. But then after a while, your limbic brain goes, oh, I just want to sleep in a bit more. I'm so tired. I'm so tired. And all of a sudden, your limbic brain wins out over your cortex and you're sleeping in, and your great plans to get a healthier lifestyle go out the window. Or let's say, whenever I get angry, I always say disrespectful things to my partner. I call them names, I say hurtful things. I need to put in a filter, a boundary, so that if I'm angry, I will not resort to disrespect. So that cortex, limbic brain agree. It's a wonderful rule. But then you get angry again. And your limbic brain is triggered when you're angry, and it's triggered intensely when you're angry. And all of a sudden you forget about that rule because right now you feel powerfully that you want to hurt that other person. And so that boundary gets dropped. And so this whole limbic brain is such a key issue to understand when it comes to boundaries and enforcing boundaries. It's whenever our limbic brain is in a negative place and it's running the show that we're going to change boundaries, we're going to go back on boundaries, and it's going to get us into trouble. So let me just give you some of the times when our limbic brain can go into a negative place, and then we can be in trouble without us even realizing it. So I call these negative demotivators, things that take away my motivation to stick to a boundary. So if I am really tired and exhausted, or if I am just stressed right out and feeling overwhelmed, all of a sudden, I'm not going to bother doing that. I'm going to procrastinate on that. All of a sudden, all the boundaries we set for ourselves, I'm going to do this, this, and this, we forget about. We're not motivated anymore. Why? Because our limbic brain is overwhelmed by fatigue, by stress. And those take the motivation away. With that, for many, is when they're sick or in physical pain. So their limbic brain is not in a good place. And all of a sudden they don't want to follow through on any of the rules that they set for themselves. Another big one is when a person is very angry, or with that, they're in ongoing tension or conflict. So again, their limbic brain is in a negative place, and when it's in that negative place, all the rules they made for themselves, they forget. They lash out, they say things that they're going to later regret, but they don't stop themselves. All the filters for their speech and behavior disappear. Another big one for many people is if they're alone too much. So they're not connecting with people, they're just all by themselves, then they get bored. And once they get bored, what happens? Oh, I'm lonely, I'm bored, maybe I'll do this, maybe I'll do this. And they start making these impulsive, rash decisions that are really unhealthy. And the whole focus is, I just need instant gratification. Doesn't matter if it's good for me or not. And that happens for many people. Another one is when you're hurt. Somebody just disrespected you, somebody ignored you, somebody called you stupid, somebody rejected you, and you feel really hurt, and you're not in a good place. You're in a lot of pain in your limbic brain. And what happens in that place of pain? I'm just going to get instant gratification. Skip all the rules I made for myself about what I'm not going to do. I just want instant gratification. That can happen also if you have an unmet need for a long time that you aren't meeting. So an unmet emotional need, an unmet relational need. So if that is not being met in a healthy way, it is taking its toll on your limbic brain, and your limbic brain is getting more and more discontent. And the more discontent it gets, the more it goes, I want instant gratification now. I don't care about all the rules I made, and so I'm not motivated to do those rules anymore. The priority now is instant gratification. What's interesting to me with that is that often when we're discontent, the very thing that we need to do that would get us to meet those needs to be healthy again is often the thing we don't feel like doing because we just want instant gratification. Then another kind of gradual thing that leads to being demotivated is just going through a stretch of difficulty or ongoing frustration. So you could have handled one or two things not going your way, one or two things being difficult, but you've just gone through 2 months of just constant frustration, and your limbic brain now is at a breaking point. And it goes, I don't care about what I plan for my life, I just want instant gratification. Another one with that is self-pity. Getting so, poor me. Again, your limbic brain is not in a good place, and you go, I just want instant gratification. So again, I hope you see that all of those things that demotivate us from sticking to personal boundaries are pain in the limbic brain. Let me take that a little bit further. We know that brain chemicals affect our limbic brain. We know that hormones affect our limbic brain. So dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, endorphins, they affect our limbic brain positively. Cortisol, opioids affect our limbic brain negatively. And so for many people, if they are in a stretch of their life where they're not having any fun, they're not having any connection, so fun, dopamine, connection, serotonin, oxytocin, they're not having a balanced life where their needs are being met, then the 4 positive chemicals aren't going to be happening in their life, and they're going to end up in a negative limbic brain space. Part of that not connecting for many people is also, if their needs aren't being met by connecting, then they start feeling lonely, but that can also be affected by testosterone and estrogen. So you have that sex drive that builds, and now you're not just lonely, you're horny. And that affects your ability to stick to the boundaries that you set for yourself. For women, when they hit their menstrual cycle, that changes their hormone, and that can affect the boundaries for them. Or you fall in love with somebody. You meet somebody and you're head over heels in love. You get this rush of oxytocin, and all of a sudden you just forget all the boundaries you set for yourself. With that, I think it's important to understand is that when we've been talking about the limbic brain, often we've been talking about just kind of negative limbic brain spaces, painful emotions. But for people from complex trauma, it's almost just as dangerous for them to be in a really good, happy place too, where they're feeling really good in their limbic brain. Because what happens then is they go, oh, wow, I feel so great. Let's just go do something. And they make rash decisions, impulsive decisions. Let's just go buy something with money we don't have. Or, I don't have to work so hard anymore. I'm just doing so great. So let's just not worry about all of this routine that we've developed for ourselves and these new habits. Or part of their old stuff kicks in and they go, I don't deserve to feel this good. We need to sabotage. And they start to sabotage their good recovery. So for many from complex trauma, it's not just a negative limbic brain space that's a problem. A good limbic brain space can also be a problem for them. And then another thing that affects the limbic brain is the mental health. So anxiety and depression. A person who has ODD or OCD, those all affect the limbic brain and put it in a not good place. So they overwhelm the limbic brain with pain. And so you can see when a person is feeling a lot of depression, it changes their boundaries. So let's say we all have a kind of a bubble, how close I feel comfortable having people in my space. A person who gets depressed, all of a sudden that bubble gets really big or really small. I just need you, or I don't want anybody around me. A person who has anxiety, all of a sudden their anxiety flares up, their bubble either gets really big or really small. And so that's boundary changing stuff. And so people then with mental health issues, they can super enforce a boundary. Nobody's going to talk to me. Nobody's getting close to me. I'm not going to do anything to help anybody. Or, I can't be bothered to enforce boundaries. It's too much work. It's too hard. And just let everything go. So the mental health really affects the limbic brain. Then there's another thing that affects the limbic brain. So think of your life as having an external environment and an internal environment. And so your internal environment is how you're meeting your own needs, taking care of yourself, a balanced life, managing your limbic brain, living out of your cortex. That's your internal world, keeping it healthy. So there's kind of 4 options. So think of plus and minus, okay? So a positive or a negative. So the ideal is to have a positive external world where everything is going well and a positive internal world where you're doing really well in taking care of yourself. That's when we enforce boundaries well. But then the second is you have a positive external world. Everything's going really well in your external world, but your internal world is struggling. You're not meeting your own needs very well. You're not connecting to yourself very well. You're starting to slip in your rules, or you got some mental health issues starting to affect you, or some deep trauma issues affecting your limbic brain in a negative way. So you've got a good external world, but your internal world's struggling. So that's, you can see, is less than ideal. Then the third scenario is everything in your external world, or a lot of things in your external world, are really struggling right now. You got problems with your job, with your kids, with your relationships, with your biological family, and it's just stress, tension, anger, all kinds of things not going well. But you're doing well internally. You're managing it well. You're keeping yourself in a good headspace. Okay, that's not ideal, but you're still kind of able to manage boundaries okay. But then you got the fourth scenario. Your external world's falling apart. It's full of stress and problems, and you're not handling it well. Your internal world is getting to a dark place. Can you see that if a person's in that fourth one, they're not going to survive very long in recovery if they don't do things to get that internal world taken care of. And so if a person's in that fourth category, pretty soon boundaries are just going to disappear. They are not going to care about boundaries anymore. And so the way to begin to change that, to get to a healthier place, there's a lot of different things that you have to do, but one of the things is to set good boundaries. And as you begin setting good boundaries for yourself and for in your external world, that can help you get to a better place. The next thing is just to really itemize what are the key things that come out of complex trauma that make it so difficult for people to set healthy boundaries. So the first is that shame thing, that I'm not good enough, that anybody that gets to know me is going to abandon me or reject me. So I have to give in to them. I have to please them. I have to put my needs aside in order to get people to like me. That's the only way I'm going to have relationships, the only way I'm going to get love, and the only way I'm going to get my needs met. And so that comes out of complex trauma. And so if that's the case, then nobody's going to set healthy boundaries. Because I'm not going to say no to somebody. I'm not going to get them mad at me. I've got to please everybody. That's essential in order to get liked, in order to get respect, in order to get my needs met. And so unless a person heals from shame, to a certain degree, they are going to be incapable of setting and enforcing healthy boundaries. Another big one is guilt. So many people from complex trauma were made to feel guilty about all kinds of different things that they didn't even do wrong. If they relaxed, they were told they were being lazy or selfish. And that was a false guilt. If dad was angry, they were told it was their fault, that they must have done something to make dad angry. And so now they're responsible for everybody else's emotions. They can't do anything to care for themselves without being told they're unloving or lazy or selfish. So they got guilt. But as soon as you feel guilt, then I can't set a boundary in that area, because then I'd feel guilty. And so guilt gets in the way. And then for many people, fear of abandonment is huge. So if I got somebody really toxic in my life that is really affecting me negatively and is keeping me unhealthy, I need to set a boundary with them. I need to get them out of my life. But then I'd be all alone. I wouldn't have anybody. I'd be abandoned again. I can't do that. And so I won't set a boundary to get rid of toxic people because I'm afraid of being alone, of abandonment. And then for other people is addiction to chaos. So boundaries, as I stick to healthy boundaries, my life gets less and less chaos. But if I'm still needing chaos to feel alive, if I haven't truly connected with myself in healthy ways so that I'm feeling joy from that healthy connection, then I need chaos to overcome the feelings of emptiness and boredom. And so I set all these good boundaries, but then I start feeling bored, and so I destroy the boundaries because I need chaos to feel alive. So again, all of those are connected to the limbic brain. The limbic brain is affected by the deep complex trauma issues. Now there's a few other things that come out of complex trauma. If you grew up and your normal was unhealthy boundaries, your normal was no boundaries, rigid boundaries, inconsistent boundaries, that's your template for boundaries. And so when you go into relationships, you just fall naturally into kind of going to that template. And that gets in the way. So many relationships start with the old template, which is an unhealthy boundaries template. And so the relationship starts with unhealthy boundaries. And then you're trying to work to get to healthier boundaries. And that's very difficult to do. So that default setting around boundaries is a big issue. Another area that comes out of complex trauma is if you had controlling parents or parents who just made rules that suited them and didn't have your best interests at heart, then you saw boundaries as bad things, boundaries as taking your fun away, boundaries as restrictive. And so it's easy for a child to begin to kind of have oppositional defiance to boundaries. As soon as somebody sets a boundary, I'm just going to do the opposite. I'm just going to rebel against it. That can get you in trouble. And so it's so important as you get older and going on in recovery is to realize no boundaries that are healthy are for my good. And so before I just react to a boundary by doing the opposite, by breaking that rule, I need to be able to think through and get feedback from healthy, wise people. Is this a boundary that's healthy for me, or is this a boundary from an unhealthy authority that's only about them? Then I can decide the appropriate response. Another huge area for people from complex trauma is the children who grew up who were spoiled, who didn't have boundaries. So there's either no rules or there were rules, but they were never enforced. So if you broke the rules, your parents just got you out of trouble. They paid off somebody, they somehow manipulated the system so that consequences were never enforced. So what you heard and what you grew up with was boundaries are really meaningless. You can always wiggle out of the consequences. Don't have to take them seriously. Just do whatever you want. The reality is that healthy boundaries are part of life. And I can wiggle out of consequences, but those consequences are eventually going to catch up with me and my life will get very painful. So that's the first area, that whole limbic brain, and learning to manage my limbic brain is a key part of this boundary issue, and it's massive for people coming out of complex trauma. But then there's the second part, is where we set these boundaries, but people don't respect them. We're hoping they will, but they don't. They challenge them. They want us to go back to the old way of doing things, the old boundaries. So this usually shows up in two key areas. So number one would be, if you grew up in a family where always kind of dad did whatever he wanted, everybody enabled dad, dad could be irresponsible, angry, and everybody just had to put up with that and try to take care of dad's emotions. There wasn't justice. You could pick on one child got spoiled, others got abused, all of those different kind of things. And you begin to realize, okay, there's a whole bunch of unhealthy rules in this family system. I'm not going to live by those rules anymore. If dad's angry, I'm not going to run around trying to make him happy. I'm going to call him on it. And so that's what you decide to do. Well, your family goes, no. You're disrupting years of how we do things around here. And now you're going to make dad even more angry. You need to go back to the old rules. So that's a common thing. The second one is you're in a relationship that's toxic or very unhealthy, and you start setting boundaries to either push that person further out of your life or totally out of your life, or to require that they treat you a certain way, and they don't like it. And so they keep wanting to come back into your life to where they used to be. So what they do to get you to go back to the old boundaries, the way it used to be, is what we call hooks. They try to hook you and pull you back to the old way. And so the skill that you have to learn in order to enforce healthy boundaries is to learn to manage hooks. Basically, you're learning to manage their ways of trying to manipulate you. Let me give you a bunch of hooks. And what's important to understand is if you're dealing with a narcissist and you set a boundary, they don't like your boundary. Boundaries to them mean they got to try harder to go back to the way they want it. And they are going to use hook 1. If that doesn't work, not a problem, they'll go to hook 2. If that doesn't work, not a problem, they'll go to hook 3. And they have a whole tackle box full of hooks that they can draw on. And they will keep using hook after hook after hook until they wear you out, or that's what they're hoping to be able to do. And so what you have to understand up front is when I go to enforce boundaries, especially with somebody who's narcissistic, I have to be prepared for a long battle. Because they're going to use every tactic they can think of to break me down and draw me back. So I tell clients, don't set a boundary unless you're willing to enforce it. And that means you're willing to enforce it for months and months against opposition after opposition, one tactic after another. Because if you set a boundary and then you cave after a week, you've trained the person that your boundaries don't mean anything, that you ultimately won't enforce them if they just keep at you long enough. So here's some of the hooks. Number 1, guilt. So you might set a boundary with your parents and they go, after all we've done for you, this is how you're going to treat us. Or after all you put us through, now you're going to treat us this way. Or, you know what, you really hurt your mom by setting that boundary. And so what happens is you feel so much guilt. I can't do this to my parents, and you pull back the boundary. Or part of that is they attempt to get you to feel sorry for them. So they might play the victim. Dad says, I can't sleep at night anymore because of the decisions you're making in your life. I'm just worried sick about you. You're changing, and I don't like it. And you go, I'm putting Dad through misery. That's terrible. Or they might falsely accuse you to create guilt. They might come up and say, you think you're better than us now. Well, no, you don't. You're just trying to get healthy. But that's how they frame it, to try to create guilt. You think you're better than us now. Or you don't value your family, I guess. You just care about you. And most of those will have flawed logic. And so another one is families are supposed to stay together no matter what. So you need to stop these dumb rules that are pulling you away from your family because we need each other. Well, that sounds really good, but that's going to keep you sick. So if guilt doesn't work, what many will then go to is crying and tears, and it's to create guilt. So mom will be crying, I can't talk to you anymore, you don't care about me anymore, and they make it all about them. You don't phone me like you used to, you don't let me talk to you about stuff, you don't share with me about stuff, and they're having a pity party to create guilt. Next one for many is they go to anger. Who do you think you are? How dare you set a boundary with your mom and dad? How can you be so disrespectful? And they get super aggressive. They try to intimidate you into changing the boundary. They might even threaten you and become abusive. And so if the anger is basically to make you go to fear and say, I better give in so nothing bad happens. So that's a powerful hook. With that often is disrespectful. They'll just beat you down. You're a loser. You never were a good kid. You were always disrespected. You're never going to amount to anything. You're just throwing your life away right now. You're throwing your family away right now. And they just are tearing you down, trying to get you to the point where you go, I'm an awful person. I'm going to lose everything. I have no value. I guess I better get rid of these rules. Another subtle thing they'll do, if none of those first 4 work, is they'll nag you. They'll just, can I phone you today? Can I phone you today? Can I phone you today? Over and over and wear you down. Or they'll do what we call triangulation. So you set a boundary with mom. You can't phone me every day, only once a week. And now you're getting a call from your aunt. And your aunt says, you're really making your mom so sad. So that's triangulation. You're bringing a third person who basically is going to take mom's side and add pressure to you to get you to change the boundary. Or they could even go beyond triangulation, and all of a sudden you get calls from aunts and uncles and grandparents. They've recruited all kinds of support to take mom's side against your new rule. Another one is they can go to games. So they can start giving you the silent treatment. You're going to set a boundary with me? Okay, I won't talk with you. Or they withhold love. You go and you want a hug and they just won't give you a hug. You want to talk, they won't talk. Or they pout. And so those are manipulation tools where they're trying again to manipulate you, that if you want love, if you want connection with me, you got to give in to me and do it my way. Or they can go to the other extreme, and that is love bombs. So all of a sudden they're giving you $100. All of a sudden they're offering to take the kids and give you a night out, and it's just overwhelming you with nice things. And it's like, oh, these are such wonderful parents. How can I say no to them and set these boundaries with them? Another one is to create a crisis. And so this would be, all of a sudden you get a phone call, oh, your dad's really going through a hard time right now. You need to come over. You need to talk to me every day because I'm going through a hard time because of this. And so this crisis all of a sudden is, you got to go back to the old way of doing things. Another subtle one is they might come back and propose a compromise. So let's say you say to a person, I can't have you in my life right now. Sorry, but I got to just focus on me, and because of your choices, it's just pulling me backwards. And so you set a boundary. And so they might say, okay, but can't we just still be friends? Maybe just once a week for coffee. So they propose a compromise. You've said, no, we can't see each other at all. And they go, well, okay, but maybe just once a week or once a month. And it sounds kind of reasonable, but it's their way of getting back in and having influence over you. And then the final one, which is a long game one. And that's kind of the gaslighting one. And it's like the best way to get a person to cave on their boundaries is to wear them down so they feel they have no value. They feel they can't think accurately for themselves. They think they don't even perceive reality for themselves. They let everybody else do their thinking for them. So you wear down their self-esteem. You increase their shame to the point they feel they have zero value. They can't think accurately. They can't perceive accurately. That can take months and years. But if you get a person to that point, then they're never going to set a boundary with you because you now can control them. And so that's what some families have done. That's what happens in some relationships. Well, let me end with some helpful tools for setting boundaries. So the first one would be, when you have things coming up in your life, prepare in advance for how you're going to respond in those settings. So even do some role playing. So let's say that you've struggled with addiction in the past. Go through in your mind, what am I going to do if I'm walking down the street and I run into my old dealer? Or I run into an old using buddy? Or I run into a John? What am I going to say to them if they say, hey, you want some drugs? Have an answer prepared. Think it through in advance so that you're ready. Because if you don't, then you get there and then you go right to panic, to your limbic brain, and you're not able to enforce a boundary. Or what am I going to do if I receive a text or a phone call from somebody I just said they can't be in my life, from my mom when I told her only once a week? How am I going to respond when that happens? And so usually I gotta have that planned out. I'm not gonna pick up the phone. I'm gonna stick to this boundary. The next thing is, don't try to change too many boundaries at once. I find so many people that I work with, they start learning about boundaries and it's like, okay, I got to set a boundary here, 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 and they come up with 100 new boundaries they need to set, and they try to set them all at once, and it's just too much. It's overwhelming for them. So pick one. Work on getting that one enforced, consistent in your life, then go on to a second one. Next, we use that guardrail illustration. So going down the road is a healthy, safe life. What I think is so important is to have in the illustration a shoulder on the road. So some gravel on the side of the road before you go off the cliff. So a lot of people, when they start making boundaries for themselves, I'm going to get up at 6 every morning, I'm going to do this every morning, and they get it all laid out, then they don't do it perfectly. And they get down on themselves. Oh, I'm failing. What's the point? Have a shoulder on the road, a grace period. Okay, I didn't get up at 6 today. I'm not going to beat myself up. I'm still learning how to do this. But I realized if I stay on the shoulder too much in the gravel, that's keeping myself in danger. That's just a little warning to me. I need to get back and figure out how to stay on the pavement. So allow yourself that grace area when you set boundaries for yourself. Next thing that I think is important for people is, let's say you have this boundary for yourself. I am going to want to start reading an hour a day. That might be unrealistic for where you're at right now. You just are not able to do that. So break it down into doable steps that gradually build towards the goal. So you might say, you know what, I can't read for an hour, but let's start with 5 minutes. And then after you do that for a while, okay, let's move it to 10 minutes. Next one with that is, a lot of people begin to realize they don't enforce boundaries because they've never stood up for themselves. They've always felt that's wrong, selfish, unloving. But now they go, no, I have to stand up for myself. That sounds great. That's a wonderful boundary, but what does that look like? And so for some people, they can't stand up to their parents right away. They're just not quite strong enough. But they can maybe stand up in one little wee area. So do that one little wee area. And then what you're going to find is that's going to gain you strength internally. Then you can start to set a boundary in another little area, till eventually you can enforce and set boundaries more and more to make your life and relationship with parents healthy. The next one is that how important then for people from complex trauma, if we want to do boundaries well, we've got to work on our underlying issues. That deep shame stuff, fear of abandonment stuff. So again, I would encourage you to take our lift course or react course. We have a whole series on boundaries that you can watch that will help you, but just so important to deal with these underlying issues. The next thing, check in on yourself. So mindfulness. Be aware, where is my limbic brain at? How much anger do I have? How much anxiety do I have? How much depression do I have? How much guilt do I have? How much shame do I have? Do that check-in several times a day, because what you're realizing is, how strong am I or how vulnerable am I? What is my internal world like? And then what is my external world like? So that is such an important part. So then build a routine that's not just healthy, but a routine that helps you stay motivated, that helps you stay in a good headspace. Make that a part of your thing, because boundaries are not just good rules, it's also motivation to do those rules. And then the final thing is accountability is often helpful. So you set a boundary, I'm going to start exercising, eating differently, going to bed. Tell somebody that you trust, that's safe about it. Somebody that's not going to use it against you, but somebody that's just going to check in on you. How are you doing with your eating? How are you doing with your sleeping? Often that motivation is just helpful, or that accountability is just helpful. as we try to get motivated and stay motivated to carry out healthy boundaries. So that's the kind of overview of boundaries. Now, as I said, there's a whole series on YouTube on boundaries that you can watch. I hope that helps you. I hope you helps you see how important this is and gives you a good starting point to get going on this important part of the journey. Well, thank you for being here.